December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning sun glimmered on still water. The sound of church bells drifted from the base chapel, mingling with the smell of coffee and machine oil. On the deck of the USS Arizona, sailors laughed, unaware that above the clouds, metal wings were already cutting through the dawn. 200 miles north, on the carrier Akagi, Japanese pilots waited in silence, gloved hands resting on throttles, eyes fixed on the horizon. They were minutes away from unleashing a storm that would shatter peace and awaken an empire. For years, the Pacific had carried an uneasy calm. The war in Europe raged, but across these waters, the hum of American machinery was routine, almost comforting. At Pearl Harbor, ships lay at anchor like sleeping giants, gray silhouettes against the turquoise sea. The sailors who tended them were young, many still teenagers, far from home, yet close to history. The United States still believed in distance, that two oceans could guard a nation from the madness overseas. But distance, like peace, was an illusion. And on the other side of that ocean, Japan's leaders had already chosen a path from which there was no return. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy prepared for war with ritual precision. Maps covered the walls of the Naval General Staff Office, pins marking targets, routes, and fuel ranges. The plan was bold, perhaps too bold. 6 aircraft carriers, 353 planes, and a silence so complete that not even their allies in Berlin would know until the skies burned over Oahu. At the center of this storm stood a man both admired and burdened, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was 57 years old, slender and soft-spoken, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War. He had studied in America, at Harvard, and served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew America, its people, its spirit, and most of all, its industry. He had seen the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the auto plants of Detroit, the endless assembly lines of a nation built for abundance. He once told a friend, "If I am ordered to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months. After that, I can promise nothing." It was not arrogance. It was prophecy. The men who served under Yamamoto revered him for his intellect, but sensed the weight he carried. He opposed war with the United States, but his duty was obedience. He was a samurai in a modern age, bound by loyalty to an emperor and a nation intoxicated by expansion. To him, the Pearl Harbor attack was not a celebration. It was a necessity, and perhaps a tragedy waiting to unfold. In his private notes, Yamamoto often reflected on Japan's limits. The empire had courage, discipline, and a formidable navy, but it lacked one thing: endurance. Its oil reserves were low, its factories were small. Its aircraft, though elegant and deadly, could not be replaced fast enough to sustain a long war. And yet, Japan's leaders believed that one swift, crushing strike could humble America into peace. They did not understand what Yamamoto understood, that America's true power was not in its ships, but in its factories. That December morning, while engines warmed on Japanese decks, the men at Pearl Harbor wrote letters, polished brass, and thought of home. In the harbor's calm surface, the reflections of 8 battleships gleamed: Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Maryland, names that carried pride, history, and within hours, grief. The first wave came at 7:48 a.m. The roar of engines broke the morning calm like a tear in the sky. Pilots shouted, "Tora! Tora! Tora!" the signal for complete surprise. Bombs fell with precision born from years of preparation. In minutes, the harbor became an inferno of smoke and steel. The Arizona exploded, its magazines igniting in a single flash that lit the sky like dawn itself. Men were thrown into the water, their bodies burning, their voices swallowed by fire. By 10 a.m., the attack was over. 21 ships lay damaged or destroyed. 8 battleships were hit, 4 sunk. More than 2,400 Americans were dead, another 1,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, the pride of the United States Navy, had been struck down in its own harbor. Across the ocean in Japan, people filled the streets in celebration. Newspapers declared the birth of a new empire. Church bells rang, students waved flags, and the government broadcast messages of divine victory. But in the quiet of his cabin aboard the battleship Nagato, Yamamoto sat alone, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. He had not joined the celebrations. He understood what few others could, that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt received the news in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of what had happened. The next day, in a speech that echoed across the world, he called it a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. 4 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The global conflict was now total. Factories that once built cars began forging aircraft. Women filled the assembly lines. Rivers of steel and sweat began to flow. And in that immense industrial heartbeat, America's response was already forming, not in words, but in production, design, and unrelenting resolve. For Yamamoto, the victory at Pearl Harbor was both brilliant and damning. He had achieved everything a strategist could hope for: surprise, precision, and devastating effect. But deep down, he knew what came next. He had studied America. He knew its people did not surrender to shock. They responded with fury and endurance. He once wrote to a friend, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Those words would outlive him. They would define the war that followed. In the stillness that came after the last explosion, the harbor smoldered beneath a haze of black smoke. Oil slicks shimmered on the water, reflecting the broken masts of ships that once symbolized strength. The Pacific breeze carried the faint scent of burnt metal and salt. For many Americans, that smell would never fade. And in Japan, Yamamoto stared out at the sea, calm, endless, and indifferent. He had struck with precision, but in his heart he felt no triumph. Only the slow, heavy certainty that history had just begun to turn against him. The silence was gone, the narrator might say, and the storm had begun. December 8, 1941, Tokyo Bay. The radio crackled with victory bulletins. Crowds filled the streets, waving paper flags, their cheers echoing between government buildings. Japan had done the impossible, destroyed the pride of the American fleet in a single morning. But in the quiet corridors of the Imperial Navy headquarters, Admiral Yamamoto felt none of that triumph. He looked at the maps pinned to the wall, the vast Pacific stretching from Tokyo to San Francisco, and he understood what others did not. This was not victory. This was the beginning of the end. The morning after Pearl Harbor, Japan stood at the peak of its power. Its navy ruled the Pacific. Its army moved swiftly through the jungles of Malaya and the islands of the Philippines. Within months, Singapore would fall, and the rising sun would fly over half the Pacific. The empire seemed unstoppable, a tide of steel and discipline surging outward from Asia. But Yamamoto knew better. He knew the empire had 6 months, maybe less, before America's might began to awaken. And he knew once that happened, Japan's fate would be sealed. He had seen it before. During his years in the United States, Yamamoto had traveled across the industrial heartland, Chicago, Detroit, New York. He had watched ships being built faster than Japan could draw the blueprints. He had seen the faces of American workers, ordinary men and women, but endless in number, tireless in spirit. He once told a colleague, "The United States is like a machine that builds itself." He meant it as both admiration and warning. As Tokyo celebrated, Yamamoto gathered his senior staff aboard the battleship Nagato. The room was thick with cigarette smoke, the smell of ink and paper heavy in the air. Charts covered the table. Supply lines, fuel routes, the limits of range and logistics. Japan's strength, he explained, was temporary. Its aircraft carriers could strike quickly, but they burned fuel faster than Japan could produce it. Its shipyards were already stretched to the limit. Its oil came from distant colonies, Indonesia, Borneo, and Malaya, territories vulnerable to blockade. The officers listened in silence. Some nodded in agreement. Others clenched their jaws, unwilling to question the victory that had electrified a nation. But Yamamoto's voice was calm, steady, deliberate. He did not shout. He did not lecture. He simply reminded them that war was not a matter of pride. It was a matter of numbers, fuel, and time. In Washington, those same numbers were being turned into action. Factories that had been idle since the Depression roared to life. Men stood in long lines to enlist. Women traded aprons for coveralls. Steel mills worked day and night, pouring rivers of molten metal that would become tanks, ships, and aircraft. The War Production Board, created within weeks of the attack, unified every American industry under one purpose: total mobilization. By the end of 1942, American shipyards would launch one new vessel every day. By 1943, a new aircraft would roll off the assembly line every 5 minutes. This was the breaking point Yamamoto had feared, not the loss of ships, but the birth of American industrial war. In the early months of 1942, Japan struck again and again. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies. Each success seemed to prove the empire's invincibility. But beneath the victories lay cracks invisible to the public eye. The empire's supply lines stretched thin. Its merchant fleet was too small to carry the fuel and raw materials needed to sustain its advance. Every battle consumed men, planes, and fuel that could not be easily replaced. For every Zero fighter Japan built, America built 10. For every aircraft carrier Japan launched, America launched 4. The numbers did not lie. They simply waited. Still, Yamamoto pressed on. He knew that the only chance Japan had was to destroy America's carriers, the heart of its naval power, before they multiplied beyond control. He began planning a new operation, a decisive battle that would force America into negotiation. His target was a small remote atoll called Midway. If Japan could lure the remaining American carriers into battle and destroy them, perhaps, just perhaps, the empire could hold what it had taken. But Yamamoto also knew he was gambling with the empire's future. He once told his aide, "If we do not win quickly, we will not win at all." Those words hung in the air like smoke. Across the Pacific, in San Diego, Los Angeles, and Seattle, American aircraft plants pulsed with life. The smell of hot metal, oil, and sweat filled the air. Posters hung on factory walls. "We can do it. Remember Pearl Harbor." Every rivet driven, every propeller turned was an act of quiet vengeance. There were no generals here, no admirals, only ordinary citizens working in shifts that never ended. They did not cheer for battle. They worked for return, for brothers lost, for ships sunk, for a harbor still burning in memory. The scale of production was beyond imagination. By 1945, the United States would produce over 297,000 aircraft. Japan, by comparison, would build 85,611. But numbers alone do not tell the story. Each American aircraft was larger, heavier, and more complex. B-17s, B-24s, B-29s, machines of endurance that carried the weight of entire factories within their wings. In Tokyo, Yamamoto continued to study reports from the front. He read them in silence, his fingers tracing the names of fallen pilots he had trained. They were brave men, and he mourned each loss. But as the war grew, he began to see their sacrifice as part of a larger tragedy, the struggle between courage and capacity. between belief and reality. He sometimes looked out over the harbor at night, the reflection of ship lights trembling on the water. He thought of the men who had died at Pearl Harbor, not as enemies, but as sailors caught in the same storm. He understood better than most that war was not measured only in victories. It was measured in endurance, the ability to keep building, to keep fighting, when everything else was falling apart. By the spring of 1942, the world stood at the edge of balance. The Axis powers held more territory than at any time in human history. From France to Burma, the map was painted in their colors. But beneath that dominance, the engines of America were awakening. The tide had begun to turn, not on the battlefield, but in the factories, in the hands of welders, machinists, and engineers who believed that freedom itself was being forged in steel. Yamamoto could feel it, the faint vibration of an enemy rising. He had struck with brilliance. But now, the storm he had unleashed was gathering its own thunder. It would not rest until it reached Tokyo. In the quiet of his cabin, Yamamoto closed his logbook and whispered a single thought: perhaps victory itself is only the beginning of defeat. He knew the breaking point had come, not with a gunshot, but with the turning of gears. The ocean was vast, the engines were loud, and history was already shifting beneath them. June 4th, 1942, the Midway Atoll, Pacific Ocean. The morning light was harsh, the sea flat and endless. On the horizon, two worlds approached one another, steel against steel, carrier against carrier. Above them, the sky filled with the sound of engines, the shriek of dive bombers cutting through cloud and silence. In that moment, the fate of the Pacific would be decided, not by strength alone, but by timing, chance, and the will of exhausted man. The Battle of Midway began as Yamamoto had planned, a trap, a mirror image of Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Navy advanced with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each a floating city of fuel, ammunition, and precision. Yamamoto's plan was elegant, even poetic in its ambition. Draw out the remaining American carriers and crush them in one decisive strike. It was the culmination of decades of naval doctrine, the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle that Japanese strategists had dreamed of since the days of Tsushima. But war does not reward elegance. It rewards adaptation. And that morning, the Pacific itself seemed to turn against him. American code breakers, working in silence in a nondescript building in Pearl Harbor, had cracked Japan's naval codes weeks earlier. They knew Yamamoto's plan, his timing, even his target. It was intelligence, not strength, that changed the tide. When the Japanese fleet approached Midway, the Americans were already waiting. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, stood hidden in the open ocean, their decks bristling with aircraft. The stage was set for one of the most decisive and brutal confrontations in naval history. At dawn, waves of Japanese aircraft roared toward Midway Island. They flew low, sunlight glinting off their wings, the pilots chanting prayers beneath their breath. Bombs fell in precise, practiced rhythm. Runways exploded, fuel tanks ignited, and the defenders of Midway, a handful of Marines and Navy personnel, fired back through smoke and flame. It seemed at first another Japanese victory. But fate, as always in war, had its own design. At 10:20 a.m., American dive bombers from the Enterprise appeared suddenly through a break in the clouds. They found the Japanese carriers exposed, their decks cluttered with fueled aircraft preparing for the next strike. In less than 5 minutes, the course of the war changed. Bombs fell in burning arcs. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu struck almost simultaneously. The explosions were monstrous, pillars of flame rising higher than the masts. Men ran through fire. Others jumped into the sea, their uniforms burning, their faces ash-gray with disbelief. By noon, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were gone, consumed by the very fuel that had powered their victory months before. Yamamoto, miles away aboard his flagship Yamato, received the reports in fragments. First confusion, then silence, then the unbearable clarity of truth. The strongest fleet in Japanese history was disintegrating before he could reach the battlefield. He stood motionless for a long time, his officers watching, waiting. No one spoke. Finally, he said quietly, "Withdraw the fleet." It was not an order of surrender. It was the recognition of fate. By evening, the fourth carrier, Hiryu, lay broken and burning. The sea was littered with wreckage, lifeboats, fuel drums, men clinging to debris as the sun set over the Pacific. The smell of burning oil spread for miles. It was not the smell of defeat alone, but of history turning. The Imperial Navy had lost 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, and many of its most experienced pilots, men who could not be replaced. Japan's offensive momentum was gone, replaced by a long, grinding struggle for survival. In America, the news of Midway spread slowly, then erupted like a second sunrise. After 6 months of loss and fear, the tide had turned. Factories redoubled their pace. Workers cheered in break rooms and shipyards. For them, it was more than victory. It was vindication. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor had been answered. Across the Pacific, however, the war was far from over. Japan still held vast territories: the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, New Guinea. But with every passing month, the imbalance of production grew wider, heavier, inevitable. America built and Japan endured. And endurance, Yamamoto knew, could not outlast industry. In Tokyo, the public never learned the full truth. The government announced a glorious victory, concealing the magnitude of the loss. But among naval officers, the truth spread like smoke. They knew the empire had crossed a line it could never retreat from. Japan had lost the initiative, and with it, the future. Yamamoto returned to Tokyo under the guise of duty, but his heart was heavy. He met with Prime Minister Tojo and other leaders, arguing for diplomacy, for negotiation. But by then, Japan's war machine had grown too proud, too committed to expansion. The machinery of war, once set in motion, obeys no man's conscience. Far away in the factories of California, the clatter of assembly lines filled the air like an anthem. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses gleamed under factory lights. Each aircraft bore the labor of thousands: engineers, welders, draftsmen, mothers. They were building not only machines, but momentum, the industrial rhythm of a nation that refused to fall. At Boeing, Lockheed, and Douglas plants, new designs rolled from drawing boards to reality in weeks, not months. Jet propulsion, radar, long-range navigation, all raced ahead, funded by a treasury as vast as Japan's imagination was limited. War was no longer about courage. It was about capacity, about who could replace what was lost. As the summer of 1942 faded, Yamamoto began to realize that his greatest fear had come true. The war he had tried to avoid had become a machine that consumed everything: fuel, metal, men, and time. He often wrote in his journal late at night, his handwriting neat, almost fragile, "We are running a race we cannot win. And yet, we must keep running." He was right. Japan would fight on for 3 more years. Brave, disciplined, doomed. But after Midway, the empire no longer dictated the rhythm of war. It merely followed the beat of American industry, relentless, mechanical, unyielding. The ocean that had once carried Japan's ambition now carried its losses. Every mile of water between Midway and Tokyo was haunted by what could have been. Yamamoto had won the admiration of his enemies, but he could not escape the truth he had always known, that victory built on illusion will always collapse under reality. And as night fell over the Pacific, the sea burned red beneath a darkening sky, a vast mirror reflecting both triumph and ruin. Fire and blood had met, the narrator might say softly, and only endurance would decide what remained. April 18, 1943, over the jungles of Bougainville, A formation of American P-38 Lightning fighters sliced through the morning clouds. Below them, the Pacific shimmered. Blue, endless, indifferent. Their mission was secret, their target a single aircraft. A Japanese transport carrying Admiral Yamamoto. Within minutes, one of the most brilliant minds of the Pacific War would fall from the sky he had once ruled. The year after, Midway was a slow, grinding descent for Japan. Its empire still stretched from Burma to the Gilberts, but the brilliance of its early victories had faded into exhaustion. Fuel was scarce. The skilled pilots who had once dominated the air were gone, replaced by boys barely trained to land on a carrier deck. The machinery of war, once smooth, precise, almost poetic, had begun to break under its own weight. Factories in Japan worked around the clock, but steel was running out. The island's mines could no longer meet demand, and oil tankers from the conquered territories were being hunted down by American submarines. Each ship that sank took with it not only supplies but hope. By 1943, Japan was fighting on memory, of honor, of duty, of what once seemed possible. Yamamoto felt the slow decay more than anyone. He was still the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, still respected, still obeyed, but increasingly isolated. His letters grew shorter. His once steady handwriting wavered. He wrote to a friend, "I am tired, not of the war but of its meaning." He toured bases across the South Pacific, visiting pilots, shaking hands, trying to offer courage where little remained. He told them Japan must endure. He never told them what he truly feared, that endurance was all they had left. In the United States, endurance had turned into momentum. The assembly lines were no longer just busy, they were unstoppable. Aircraft factories had become cities of light. Men and women worked in 3 shifts, 7 days a week. Steam and sweat filled the air. The pounding of hammers echoed like drums of industry. Everywhere there were slogans, "Keep 'em flying," "More planes," "Faster." And the planes did come. B-24s with wings wider than houses, sleek P-51 Mustangs, and the new B-29 Superfortress, a flying machine that could reach Japan itself. The difference between the two nations had become irreversible. While Japan scavenged for metal, America drowned in it. While Japan rationed fuel, America refined it by the million barrels. It was not strategy that was deciding the war now, it was capacity. The power to replace what was lost faster than the enemy could destroy it. In the spring of 1943, American intelligence intercepted a coded message, Yamamoto's travel itinerary. He planned to visit forward bases near Bougainville to boost morale. The message, decrypted by American codebreakers, reached the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz. The Americans faced a question: should they strike one man, even one so symbolic? The answer came swiftly. Yamamoto was more than a commander. He was a symbol of Japanese precision, intellect, and leadership, the architect of Pearl Harbor. If he could be reached, he could be silenced. Operation Vengeance was born. At dawn on April 18, 1943, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal. They flew low, just above the waves, conserving fuel, radio silent. Their flight path was calculated to the minute, 600 miles across open sea to intercept Yamamoto's transport at the exact moment it appeared over Bougainville. It was a gamble of navigation and fate. At 9:34 a.m., they saw it. 2 twin-engine Japanese bombers escorted by fighters. The Americans broke formation and attacked. In seconds, the sky erupted with gunfire. Tracer rounds tore through the air, engines screamed, metal shattered. One of the Japanese bombers burst into flame and fell into the jungle canopy. The other, riddled with bullets, limped toward the coast and crashed into the trees. Inside that wreckage lay Admiral Yamamoto, still wearing his white gloves, still clutching his sword. He had died instantly. When Japanese search parties found him hours later, his body was seated upright, as if still in command. His face was calm. The soldiers who recovered him wept silently. They understood that something far greater than a commander had been lost. They had lost the last voice in their ranks who understood the limits of war. In Tokyo, the news was kept secret for days. When it was finally announced, the empire mourned. Flags were lowered. Students wrote poems of loyalty. But beneath the surface, a deeper silence spread, the realization that the man who had foreseen Japan's defeat was now gone. For the United States, Yamamoto's death was hailed as justice, even vengeance. But among the American pilots who carried out the mission, the feeling was more complex. They had killed an enemy, yes, but also a soldier who had warned against the very war he was forced to lead. War had no room for irony. It consumed the thoughtful and the ruthless alike. In the months that followed, Japan's decline accelerated. The battles of the Solomons, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls bled the empire of its remaining strength. Every victory came at a cost that could not be replaced. Fuel convoys vanished beneath American torpedoes. Planes were built faster than pilots could be trained to fly them. And the American tide, vast, impersonal, unstoppable, kept rising. By late 1943, Japan had lost control of the skies it once dominated. By 1944, the Mariana Islands would fall, bringing U.S. bombers within reach of Tokyo itself. Yamamoto's warning, once a whisper, had become prophecy. In the final months of that year, a Japanese officer visited the wreckage of Yamamoto's plane, still deep in the jungle. He wrote in his diary, "The trees have grown through the wings. It is as if the earth itself has claimed him, not as a conqueror, but as a witness." The war was far from over, but for Japan, something irretrievable had ended with Yamamoto's fall. He had been the mind of the Navy, the conscience of its ambition, and the soul of its doubt. Without him, the war became mechanical, a motion without direction, a storm without reason. As the sun set over the Pacific that year, the horizon glowed red once again, but this time not from victory. It was the color of exhaustion, of an empire burning itself to stay alive. And somewhere beyond the clouds, the voice of a lost admiral seemed to linger, asking the same question he had asked before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. What if victory itself is the first act of defeat? The admiral was gone, but his prophecy remained, echoing through the engines of war still turning without him. August 1944, Tokyo. Air raid sirens wailed through the dark like distant horns on a black sea. Searchlights crossed the clouds, thin white blades cutting through smoke. In a small workshop near Ueno, an old machinist pressed his palms together and whispered a prayer. He could no longer hear the bombers, Maliwipe, only the hum of his lathe, the last sound of an empire trying not to die. By 1944, the war had turned into endurance, a test not of courage, but of how long nations could survive the weight of their own exhaustion. Japan's borders still stretched across the Pacific on paper, but the map no longer matched reality. Island by island, mile by mile, the empire was shrinking. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes like silent predators. Oil tankers burned on the sea. Convoys vanished without trace. In Tokyo, ration cards replaced meals, and the nights grew darker as electricity failed. Children collected scrap metal for planes that would never fly. The nation that once dreamed of mastery over the Pacific now lived by candlelight. From the skies came the new sound of inevitability, the steady mechanical thunder of the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. They flew higher than Japanese fighters could reach, faster than anti-aircraft guns could follow. Their silver fuselages reflected moonlight, and their bomb bays carried the weight of entire factories. On clear nights, people could see them pass overhead, long lines of stars moving with unnatural precision. Then came the whine of falling bombs, the earth lifting underfoot, the flash of orange against black. Entire districts disappeared in minutes. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Each city reduced to ashes, its rivers running with fire. For the first time, Japan's war was visible from every home. The smell of smoke was everywhere, on clothes, in food, in hair. The empire that had once defined itself by discipline now measured its days by what still stood at dawn. In the ruins, life continued in small, defiant ways. Women dug through rubble for family photographs. Teachers held lessons in basements lit by oil lamps. Soldiers returning from the front bowed silently to empty stations, their uniforms faded, their eyes hollow. They no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of survival, of making it to the next sunrise. The emperor's voice was still distant, broadcast through static and propaganda, but the people had begun to feel the truth in their bones. The long night had begun, and it would not end quickly. Across the Pacific, America's light grew brighter. In Detroit, the night shifts never stopped. Rail lines carried endless streams of munitions to the ports of San Francisco and Seattle. Each crate, each bullet, each engine was another hour subtracted from Japan's future. By now, the numbers defied imagination. The United States was producing more aircraft every month than Japan could in a year. Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels, slid down the ways every few days, their hulls still warm from welding. Industrial America had become a single organism, fed by purpose and vengeance, its heartbeat the rhythm of pistons and presses. Even President Roosevelt understood that the war had become an equation, machines plus time or victory, and the American clock was running faster than anyone else's. In the halls of the Imperial Navy, that equation was no secret. Yamamoto's successors, Admirals Koga and Toyota, studied reports that read like obituaries. Fuel reserves, 3 months. Training pilots, insufficient. Fleet readiness, 40%. They spoke of counterattacks, of new weapons, of miracles. But miracles do not appear in factories without power. When Japan launched its last major offensive in the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the result was disaster. Hundreds of aircraft were lost in what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The sea was littered with wreckage, the air with falling wings. It was not battle, it was erasure. After that, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist as a decisive force. It would fight on in fragments, scattered and starving, but its era had ended. The civilians, however, still endured. Night after night, they watched the horizon glow red and waited for dawn. There was dignity in their silence. They rebuilt houses with debris, planted gardens in bomb craters, and shared rice one handful at a time. Each act of survival was a quiet rebellion against the darkness. In one diary found after the war, a woman wrote, "We have no more strength to hate. We only have the strength to endure." That sentence, more than any speech, captured the soul of the long night. In America, victory no longer felt glorious. Letters from soldiers described jungles filled with disease, beaches soaked in blood. The advance toward Japan was measured in corpses and coral. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, each island bought at terrible cost. The engineers and factory workers back home felt it too. They no longer cheered at production milestones. They simply worked. Every plane that left the assembly line carried a prayer that someone they loved would come home inside it. War had become impersonal, but grief never is. By early 1945, the Japanese homeland was a shadow. Railways barely functioned. The once great shipyards of Kure and Yokosuka stood half silent, their cranes twisted, their docks flooded. Children were taught to fight with bamboo spears. Old men patrolled beaches that no longer mattered. The empire had been reduced to faith, faith in an emperor unseen, in a destiny unfulfilled, in a victory that no longer existed outside of words. But even faith requires fuel, and Japan had none left. When historians later counted the cost, they found a paradox. The greater the destruction, the deeper the endurance. In those dark months, Japan discovered the strength that Yamamoto had admired and feared, the ability to suffer without surrender. But endurance without hope is only survival, and survival without purpose is the slowest kind of defeat. The night over Tokyo never truly ended. It simply faded into smoke and silence. From above, the burned-out grid of the city resembled the deck of a vast, ruined ship drifting in the sea. Below, the people waited for surrender, for salvation, for whatever came next. The guns were still firing on distant islands, but in hearts and homes, the war had already turned into memory. But the long night, the narrator might say softly, was not measured in hours or victories. It was measured in the distance between what a nation dreamed and what it became. August 6, 1945, Hiroshima, Japan, 7:09 a.m. The air was clear, almost too calm. Children walked to school, factory workers checked their watches. A single American B-29, the Enola Gay, glinted high above the clouds. What fell from its belly would not sound like war. It would sound like silence swallowing the world. When the bomb detonated, the morning became light. Not sunlight, but a white radiance so bright it erased shadows, names, and history. Buildings vanished, streets melted. In seconds, a city of 350,000 people ceased to exist. From miles away, survivors described the sound as a single, deep breath. Then came the wind, a wall of heat and dust, carrying pieces of the world it had just destroyed. The Americans called it Little Boy. To those who lived through it, it had no name, only memory. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. 2 cities, 2 bombs, and a silence that still has not fully ended. The war that began with Yamamoto's precision at Pearl Harbor ended with an equation of unimaginable simplicity. 1 plane, 1 bomb, 1 instant, and an entire empire brought to its knees. But the reckoning of 1945 was not just Japan's. It belonged to everyone who had built this machine of destruction. The engineers, the scientists, the men in uniforms and in factories who had turned matter itself into a weapon. For the first time in history, mankind understood that war no longer needed soldiers to destroy a nation. Only science, only calculation, only will. In Washington, President Truman announced the success of the atomic mission with solemn pride. He spoke of ending the war, of saving lives, of justice for Pearl Harbor. And yet, even in victory, there was a tremor, a realization that something irreversible had been done. General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, wrote in his report, "The weapon worked as intended." But beneath that sentence was a truth too vast for language, that the line between creation and annihilation had finally disappeared. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito faced a different reckoning. His palace, once untouchable, now lay within reach of American bombers. His advisors debated surrender or extinction. The military urged resistance to the end. The civilians, burned, starved, exhausted, simply waited. Then, on August 15, 1945, for the first time in history, the voice of the emperor was heard by his people. It came through static and soft distortion, formal, distant, almost ghostly. He did not use the word surrender. He spoke, instead of enduring, the unendurable. Across Japan, men and women knelt in silence. Some wept, some simply stared at the ground. The war was over, but peace did not come like light. It came like exhaustion. When the occupation began, American soldiers entered cities that looked less like battlegrounds and more like archaeological ruins. Entire neighborhoods were flat, burned wood, twisted metal, fragments of porcelain. Children scavenged for food among the ashes. Factories once devoted to aircraft production were silent except for the echo of wind through broken roofs. In those ruins, the victors found notebooks filled with designs, engines, torpedoes, aircraft that had never been built, dreams of conquest that had turned into blueprints of nothing. One American engineer who walked through the Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya later said, "It felt like walking through the skeleton of a civilization that tried to outfly its own humanity." In the months that followed, truth began to surface in documents, in confessions, in memories that could no longer be hidden. Japan's leaders faced tribunals. Generals spoke of duty, engineers of necessity, soldiers of obedience. Each story was the same. They had done what they believed must be done, but belief does not erase consequence, and duty does not absolve memory. Yamamoto was gone, but his words were remembered, his warning before the war, that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, before America's industrial tide swallowed everything. He had been right in every calculation. The reckoning had come not through genius or will, but through the cold arithmetic of industry. In the United States, the reckoning took a different form. The workers who had built the bombers went home. The women who had riveted wings and cast shells were told to return to domestic life. The factories grew quiet. The banners of victory faded, replaced by the slow unease of peace. Historians would later call it the Great Demobilization, but for many, it felt like stepping out of a dream or a nightmare. Some engineers who had worked on the atomic bomb could not sleep afterward. Physicist Robert Oppenheimer, when asked about the first test in New Mexico, quoted an ancient text, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was not a boast, it was a confession. Across the Pacific in Japan, reconstruction began. Slow, fragile, human. Men rebuilt factories not for war but for survival. Women swept streets that no longer had names. The old machinist in Ueno returned to his lathe, this time making parts for bicycles. He said, "It feels better to make something that moves a person, not destroys him." In those small acts of rebuilding, the reckoning found its meaning, not in punishment, but in remembrance. By 1946, American occupation forces had uncovered the full scale of industrial disparity. In the course of the war, the United States had produced 97,000 aircraft, 6,000 tanks, 100 ships. Japan had produced a fraction of each. But the numbers alone did not tell the story. The real difference lay in philosophy. America built to sustain, endless supply lines, repair, logistics. Japan built for perfection, for the single strike, the flawless weapon, the warrior's precision. In the end, it was not courage that decided the war, but adaptability. And in that truth lay the deepest reckoning of all. One American historian wrote years later, Yamamoto understood that war in the modern age is not a duel of heroes, but a contest of factories. It was a truth that cost millions of lives to learn, and one that the world has tried ever since not to forget. When the ashes settled, when the cities were rebuilt and the engines began again, humanity stood at a new threshold, capable of building anything, and therefore capable of destroying everything. The war had ended, but the age it began, the age of total war, of industry as weapon, had only just begun. The reckoning was not about who won. It was about what was lost. The innocence of believing that progress was always good and that war could ever again be clean. April 18, 1954, Bougainville Island, South Pacific. A group of Japanese veterans walked through thick jungle under a rain-soaked sky. They were searching for something not lost, but remembered. At last they found it, a rusted aircraft split in two, wrapped in vines. A white-gloved skeleton still sat in the cockpit. Admiral Yamamoto had come home at last to silence. Time had softened the wounds of war, but it had not erased them. The Pacific, once a battlefield, had become a cemetery of steel. Beneath its calm waters lay the bones of ships, planes, and men, a continent of memory. In the years after 1945, both America and Japan rebuilt, one in triumph, the other in humility. Factories that once forged weapons now produce cars, radios, and household machines. The same hands that had built Zero fighters now built engines for peace. But beneath the hum of post-war progress lingered the echo of what had been learned and what had been lost. In Japan, the transformation was astonishing. Within 2 decades, the nation rose from ruin to become one of the most advanced industrial powers in the world. The same discipline that had once fueled its navy now fueled its economy. The spirit of Yamamoto, precision, excellence, relentless work, was reborn in factories lit by fluorescent light instead of fire. But it was not the same Japan. The new generation grew up beneath the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, their schools teaching peace instead of conquest. They looked at the wreckage of Yamamoto's aircraft in museums and asked questions their fathers could not answer. Why had a nation so intelligent, so capable, believed that war could ever bring security? In America, victory brought its own burdens. The industrial machine that had once united the country began to shift toward consumerism and the Cold War. The bomber plants now built jetliners. The research labs that had split the atom turned toward the hydrogen bomb. War had ended, but the machinery of power never stopped turning. President Eisenhower, himself a general of that war, warned the nation in his farewell address, "Beware the military-industrial complex." He knew what he was speaking of, the silent momentum of factories that could only survive by preparing for the next conflict. The story of Yamamoto's war became more than a chapter in military history. It became a mirror, reflecting both the brilliance and the blindness of mankind. He had understood before almost anyone else that modern war would no longer be decided by valor, but by velocity, by the ability to build faster than one could destroy. Yet he had been trapped within the very system he tried to warn. When his remains were returned to Japan in 1954, they were carried through the streets of Tokyo in a quiet procession. No fanfare, no slogans, just respect. Old sailors saluted as his urn passed by. Students bowed. Even American officers sent wreaths. He was remembered not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen too far ahead and paid for it with his life. In museums across the world today, his image still endures, a thin man in a white naval uniform, eyes distant, expression calm. Beneath his portrait, a small plaque often bears his most famous words, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Visitors stop and read it. Some nod in recognition, some smile at its prophetic clarity. Few realize that it was not a boast. It was an epitaph for the age of limited war, an age that ended in the smoke of Pearl Harbor. As the 20th century moved forward, the legacy of that industrial war deepened. The lessons of Pearl Harbor became the foundations of deterrence, technology, and global balance. Nations learned that power was no longer about territory, but production, about who could innovate faster, build stronger, reach farther. The Cold War turned the world into a vast, tense workshop. America and the Soviet Union measured their strength not in battles, but in output: missiles, satellites, nuclear silos, and computer circuits. In this new kind of war, factories once again became front lines. The ghosts of 1941 still whispered in the sound of every engine. In Japan, the memory of destruction turned into a quiet philosophy. Cities rebuilt with precision. Trains ran on time. The discipline of the samurai transformed into the perfectionism of the engineer. Out of ruin came renewal, proof that even in defeat, endurance can create beauty. But for every gleaming skyline, there remained one empty space: Hiroshima. There, the ruins of the atomic dome still stand against the sky, not as accusation, not as absolution, but as memory. Each year, the people gather beneath paper lanterns and let them drift along the river. Each flame carries a name, a wish, a fragment of what was lost. They do not chant for revenge. They whisper for peace. And across the Pacific in the United States, veterans and historians still walk through hangars and shipyards that once roared with war. They run their hands over the cold hulls of battleships, the wings of restored aircraft, the rivets made by hands long gone. Each piece of steel carries a story of courage, fear, invention, and cost. One American pilot who flew in 1945 said, "Many years later, we built everything to end a war. We never thought about what it meant to build for peace." His words capture the weight of the 20th century, that progress and destruction had become twins, born from the same foundries. Today, when historians speak of World War II, they often use numbers: millions of tons of steel, thousands of ships, hundreds of cities. But the true measure of that war lies not in quantity, but in memory, in the echo of footsteps through burned streets, in the hum of an engine that once carried a man into the sky, in the silence that followed when the engine stopped. The story of Yamamoto and the industrial war he unleashed is not a tale of victory or defeat. It is a reminder that courage without reflection leads to ruin, that intelligence without mercy builds perfect machines for imperfect hearts, and that every generation inherits not just the world its fathers made, but the tools they left behind. When you stand before a museum display, a Zero fighter's propeller, an American bomb casing, a photograph of Pearl Harbor's smoke, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of factories, the ringing of metal, the steady voice of men and women who believed they were shaping history, and they were. They shaped it with steel and with silence. In the end, history remembers the weapons. But it is the builders and the believers who define what kind of world those weapons create. War doesn't vanish. It changes its shape and waits to be rediscovered.